Uh, Good evening, class. My name is Lance Smith. I'll be discussing on the paper I wrote called Violence Against Women Act of 1994. Add a little bit of stalking in there also. I choose VAWA, which I'm going to refer to the Women of Violence Act as VAWA from now on, due to case, but just my experience in as being a police officer and experiencing these domestic violence issues, and also a close family member of mine experienced this firsthand. Each state has different penalties for domestic violence. For those purposes of this paper, I focus just to focus on federal law. Okay, first I'll start with the history of the act. In 1967, the president, which is Lyndon B. Johnson, created a commission to help with domestic crimes. This is because women's issues were really delicate at the time. Rape and those other violent acts of women were not discussed, considered harassment, or pretty much a family issue. So police really didn't get involved at that time until there became a really big problem with domestic violence. During the 1980s, documentation of these domestic violence abuses, visits to the same locations, research about domestic violences were just beginning. Police were in effect working to help with the creation of services for women. This is where you get your victims assistance that we see today that's actually evolved into what it is today from police departments. The response rates of police were so much quicker now since the beginning or since the creation of the commission to help with these domestic violence issues. When the commission was finally kind of fizzling out, federal government realized that the template for VAWA had just been started. So they had a starting point to where they could actually start having a discussion and combat domestic violence. People began to see domestic violence more than just a marital problem. They knew that domestic violence calls could lead to serious assaults and even homicides. There were the three T's with the history of VAWA: the targeting, testing, and tracking created from these criminal justice organizations. Targeting helped prevent domestic violence by the info collected by the police. You know, the report writing, the statistics, the arrest, all these things that police officers would do. The hope was to stop domestic violence before it occurred. We actually see this today. If anyone worked as a police officer, my many years as a police officer, I have arrested people in the event that domestic violence might happen. If you go to a call and you see that there's an argument or there's some kind of domestic issue, you won't leave until you know those people are safe. So I've had people actually threaten each other after we left with domestic violence of partners, and at that point we could arrest to prevent future violence. So that was a good part of the VAWA that took effect, that actually states took after on that aspect. Targeting help prevented by the domestic violence by info collected by the police. The hope was to stop domestic violence before it occurred. The Crisis Intervention Unit was the beginning of the discussion about domestic violence. Arrest warrants, programs for the offenders. Tracking was slow at first, but this allowed the creation of the National Incident-Based Reporting System to track offenders and to add domestic violence finally to the Unified Crime Report, the UCR. This is a big deal to track domestic violence and see if any laws had to be changed or updated or any penalties need to be added. Became really good because this, everybody knows the UCR is tracked by the FBI, but it is reported by police agencies. There was a growing need for the federal government to make a law for domestic violence, as all parties involved are affected. Not just the victims, but you have the children, anybody who's witnessed domestic violence, known as, of course, everybody knows as secondary victimization. There are programs for this, even at the state level. When we would work domestic violence, we would fill out domestic violence packets, and we would offer like counseling services to those who were secondary victimized from the trauma of witnessing domestic violence, especially for young children. I don't know if anybody knows Rebecca Schaefer, who was an actress that was killed in 1989 by stalker Richard Bardo. I actually remember her because I'm an 80s kid. In the TV show My Sister Sam, she was a really growing actress and becoming very popular at that time, probably about the mid to late 80s. The media sensationalized her death and in essence pushed for more action. Okay, the only way they would push for more action for domestic violence or even stalking was you had to be a popular figure. Jodie Foster in the Hinckley incident with Ronald Reagan was a big one. And people started seeing this, that if you weren't an actor, you weren't so popular in the media, why would you get this voice for domestic violence? So those who were not movie stars deserved a voice. So in 1994, VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, was signed into law by President Clinton. Okay, what does VAWA do? The act is extremely large or extremely broad in the amount of services it provides to domestic violence victims. It's a social problem that's concerned men and children who witness it as well, like we talked about earlier, this secondary victimization. The Office of Violence Against Women finally became part of the Department of Justice due to the amount of funding and services it started to receive. So when it became part of the Department of Justice, people really started to take notice to what this act actually does. All right, the core of VAWA, I think I'm going to speak, there's a lot of them, so probably about, 6 or 7 of them that are kind of important that I thought were important because of time restraints, of course. The first one is the Safe Streets for Women Act. Okay, this increased the federal penalties for sex crimes. Okay, the second one was the Safe Homes for Women Act. Created a toll-free number, a hotline, interstate enforcement, restitution, and all states to enforce protection orders. So you see that today. In these victim assistance packets we have, there are toll-free numbers they can call any time of the day, 24/7. Interstate enforcement, that means that local jurisdictions will act on this. It's not just solely the federal, because it is federal law. Restitution helps the victims pay for medical bills. It's actually ran through the DA's office, the Victim Assistance Program here in Texas. Helps pay for medical bills. It helps relocation fees. If you want to find another job, they help you find another job, training, a place to stay, like a place called Safe Haven, which I took victims to in Arlington. I'm not going to disclose that location because it's supposed to stay secret, but there are places like this, the women's shelters, that will help them get back on their feet after domestic violence issues. And of course, enforcement of protection orders, which is huge. I've done a lot of protection orders in my career as a police officer, and it's not just civil anymore. There can be major penalties for these violations if they are violated by the offenders. And the district attorney's office, the criminal justice system do take these serious, because it can add another 3 to 4 years onto your sentence if you do violate, and that's every time. So they've come a long way in protecting domestic violence victims with these protection orders. The core of VAWA, only said a few, although I guess I was right there, wasn't I? Okay, third one, civil rights, remedies for gender-motivated violent act. Rape victims remain anonymous, and all persons the right to be free from crimes of violence and motivated by the offender. Okay, I've used this a lot, especially for rape victims. When we go take a call for a rape victim, they can use pseudonym forms. Okay, we actually fill out pseudonym forms. They can make up their name and put on these forms because they don't want to reveal who they are for probably embarrassment issues. Sometimes I've seen that, embarrassment issues, or they want to hide their identity from future retribution by the offender or the offender's family. So they will use pseudonyms even all through the court process. They will be referred to as a certain name, which is extremely, I think is a great idea. And it helps report the domestic violence or rape issues or rape crimes. Excuse me. Number 4 is the Equal Justice Women of the Courts Act. It appropriated funds for educating, testing, training judges, police, prosecutors, and foremost determine instances of bias. These are really good programs. I actually went through at least once a year, I believe, 8-hour courses for our in-service training, just to get updated on what was going on, and how to, if there's any law changes, or how to approach women who have been raped, or women who have been stalked, or domestically assaulted. Violence Against Women Improvements Act includes pretrial detention, which now, if you get arrested for domestic violence, you cannot bond out until you see the judge, which could be a day or two sometimes. But also, we've turned a piece of paper which gives that victim 4 hours before we release it. He's getting ready to bond out. Like I said, the person's getting ready to bond out. We will call the victim. Our jail will call the victim, say, hey, we're going to hold him for 4 more hours to let you know that he's being released, and they can take appropriate action from there. Testing for STDs, strengthening of restitution for victims, like I talked before, job relocation, education services, things like that, reporting campus assaults, reporting battered women syndrome, confidential addresses like Safe Haven is, and also reports problem for record keeping issues. National Stalker and 6 months National Stalker and Domestic Violence Reduction brought stalking as part of domestic violence to the national level, which is great because everybody's finally getting to understand what it is. Protection of battered women, immigrant women, and children. Protects those who are aliens. May stop deportation, battered spouses, or child. This is great. It falls along the line of human trafficking also. We have a lot of undocumented immigrants, especially here in Texas, and they deserve the same treatment as victims as anyone else. So a lot of them hide this because they don't want to be deported. So they keep having the domestic assaults portrayed against them, even children. But now we have a mechanism in place that can protect them from this. Give them U visas, for example, to help aid in prosecution, because they deserve just as much protection as any ordinary citizen should get. Okay, I'm going to stalking a little bit. Prior to Schaefer's death, there was really no definition of stalking. It was referred to as just harassment. In the 1980s, women had restraining orders. They are often violated. Media define them as lovesick, mentally ill, or nonviolent. Media also blame the victims for their rapes. So, stalkers can follow, call to work, send gifts, show up, threaten, phone calls, threaten family members. It became a real big problem. So stalking was seen as a major role in the cycle of violence. Finally, stalking 7.5 million stalked per year. 75% are female, 25% are male. Intimate partners are most likely responsible for stalking. I've seen a lot of stalking cases when I was working that were really non-related at that point, but the majority are. 70% women are killed by stalking before they're even or 76% of women killed were stalked before they were killed. 1 in 7 victims move away. Personality changes such as PTSD, anxiety, depression occur in 86% of the victims. This again is secondary victimization. They relive this over and over again. So we have to offer services for them. Only 1/3 of the states recognize first-time stalking as a felony. Unfortunately, Texas does not. Unless it's changed. I retired from Arlington PD a couple of years ago. So as far as I knew back then, stalking was just a Class A misdemeanor. So it might have changed in the last legislative meeting. I don't know. I've been gone a couple of years. Positive and negative reviews. I did not include my personal story, of course, for time restraints, but there was one specific case I thought was pertinent to this. I worked about 12 years ago. This young lady was stalked just from someone she didn't know. Was starting to stalk her. She did call us for help. Of course, we responded. The issues became, they didn't want to take it because, there wasn't a pattern of violence. There wasn't, they thought it was a random thing. As over 4 months, the thing happened over 4 months. And I made myself personally 19 calls of service out to her place, where she was at her home, her work, her school, out at the mall. I think one was out the ballpark, the Rangers ballpark. I could see the pattern of violence in the building, but because it wasn't a domestic violence issue, it wasn't taken seriously. I had knockdown drag-out fights with the DA over this, saying you need to take this as a stalking case. But they kept saying, no, if it's going to be something, it's going to be harassment. So in the essence of that, nothing was really done about it. The protective orders couldn't be done because it wasn't a domestic violence issue. She had to get a restraining order, which is civil here in Texas. That's what she tried to do. Of course, she violated that. And I think the 19th time I was out there, I actually logged in my car, I looked down, I saw the address. It was a death investigation. So I went out there, ended up, she was actually killed by her stalker, and he committed suicide. So it started from nothing to, you know, him dying or him killing her and then taking his own life. I had a real big issue with that. I've voiced my opinion many times, but the way things are in the criminal justice system, it would, of course, it fell on deaf ears. So that actually stays with me to this day. You know, I think about it all the time what I could have done to help this young lady. We failed her. The system failed her. I failed her as a police officer, and that's something I'm going to have to live with the rest of my life. But you know, there's just the political aspect of these policies. In 2002 and 2005, two of the largest programs were created by VAWA. Called STOP, S-T-O-P, which is services training officers, prosecutors, and then arrest. STOP made sure that all crimes, not just violence crimes, would be responded to quickly. I'm getting a visit by a dog. I'm sorry. Yeah, everything would be responded to quickly, not just the violent cases, but the stalking, the harassment. All these are priority 1 calls now. If you know the hierarchy for how they code calls when you go out as a police officer, these are priority 1 calls. Arrests made per year made it very clear that domestic violence was a serious problem. Reports were to be treated as such. Yes, I think about 60% of all the calls that were taken as a police officer, about 60% were some kind of domestic violence issue, whether it's just an argument, which was a fight, knockdown, drag out, assaults, or even, you know, deaths. They were treated as such. I don't know if you remember Jillian Smith, as a police officer, one of our police officers in Arlington, who was killed in a domestic situation about 10 years ago. She responded to one that was just a domestic violence report, sent 1 officer, and that ended up, the guy came back, kicked the door down, shot and killed Jillian, shot and killed the person giving the report. The child did escape, thank God. But that situation, it changed the policy of how we treated domestic violence as police officers from Arlington at that point. It was a sad situation that should have never happened. Biennial reports to Congress on the effectiveness of the grant program under the VAWA reported in 2002 that 1 million victims had already received services, advocacy, legal aid, crisis intervention, and response teams. So this is actually working. Because it is working, you'll see every police department actually has a victim assistance unit that will come out and talk to these victims. The police officer can do it. Pull out the packet, you read it, you give them the information, or if they want to actually talk to someone about counseling, we can request that a victim assistant or victim advocate come out and speak to the victims and give them the same information, but can get more detail because they're trained for that. Sexual assault nurses, SANE has become huge. Even when I was a police officer, became huge in domestic violence issues, or not really domestic violence, but rape issues. We always had to take ours to John Peter Smith Hospital in Fort Worth for adults, because I always had a nurse 24/7 to give SANE exams. This helps aid in the prosecution. It collects evidence, it interviews, they do the forensic interviews, they do all the things needed to assist in prosecution. Cook's Children's Hospital does children under the age of 15. So we had those 2 hospitals we could take. All right. Let's get through this real quick. The pros and cons. The pros, the ACLU called VAWA one of the most important pieces of legislation enacted to end domestic violence. National Organization of Women gave kudos to the act of massive funding provided. Cons, there's an outlet for minor arguments to be considered domestic violence, and people would abuse those acts. They do all the time. Columnist Kathy Young stated that VAWA pits women against women, or excuse me, women against men. And also people believe that they are geared specifically towards women rather than men. All right, policy implications. VAWA is a much large and broad provisional act. There will always be changes. where the policy is working as a matter of opinion due to political issues, which I've ran into quite a few times. Some provisions may sit for a while and never pass. Lobbying and support is continuous. They're always adding to it. Policy set to expire again in 2019. It's not an ongoing policy. There are many provisions that are being considered, but until the House and Senate can decide on unity, some provisions may have to wait. Okay, my main request would to have states consider stricter penalties for first-time domestic violence. Instead of slap on the wrist or probation, there should be some kind of time served or punishment that fits that crime, where they'll think again before doing it. A stalker can turn, like I've mentioned before, a stalker can turn from a follower to a murderer very quickly. We can all participate in helping each other recognize domestic violence in an effort. I don't say we can ever, end it forever, but we can actually curb it enough for people to know that it is wrong, and there will be penalties for that. Okay, if there's any questions, I guess I'll be answering them a little bit later. Thank you for listening. Have a good night. Well.